Hi, so this is just an attempt to talk through some of the ways we've tried to structure a course book in a sort of way which doesn't revolve around PPP, the kind of present, practice, produce approach to grammar that I think's dominated course books for quite a long time. One of the reasons both Andrew and myself got interested in writing course books was because we found that the PPP approach, which I think is still very much the dominant approach to many course books, was very limited in lots of ways. I think there's a real issue involved in presenting one big block of grammar in isolation and practicing that grammar in isolation, and then expecting students to be able to have normal conversations. Because normal conversations don't just use one structure to state the bleeding obvious. Normal conversations involve the interaction of all kinds of different structures. And in normal everyday conversation, you get different grammatical structures repeated, recycled, revisited. And we were interested in working out other ways of presenting material to students and sublimating the grammatical focus to a broader communicative kind of goal, if you like. Okay? And in a sense, this is why the series that we've ended up producing was called Outcomes, because what we were primarily interested in, what we still are primarily interested in, is the communicative outcome that we think students will be able to achieve. So let's just have a look at a few examples of what we might be talking about here. I think the traditional way that course books define outcomes has long been in terms of grammar syllabuses, and it's been to do with, the outcome of this lesson will be students can manipulate sentences using the present perfect simple, or students will get repeated exposure to narrative tenses or whatever. And actually, if you start thinking about outcomes in other kinds of ways, there are different sorts of outcomes that you might want to try and achieve with your students. The Common European Framework has some very interesting ideas about what desirable outcomes of language teaching should be. And the CEFR, take your pick, basically structures this in sort of three main ways. It says that the business of language teaching, of any particular kind of language teaching, should really be threefold. When we're teaching any kind of language to foreign students, we should be aiming to help them deal with the business of everyday life in a foreign country, and to help them help foreign people in their country deal with the business of everyday life. We should be helping our students to communicate their ideas, their thoughts, their feelings and their opinions with other young people around the world. And the big kind of idealistic goal, through learning a foreign language, students should deepen their understanding of other cultures, other ways of thinking and other ways of being. Okay? And hopefully you'll agree that those are kind of desirable outcomes or desirable goals of language teaching. I think they're also, in a sense, a kind of filter or a kind of framework within which teachers can view and analyze classroom material that they're thinking of taking into their classrooms. When you're looking at what you're planning to be teaching, I think you need to ask yourself, does this in some way help me deal with the business of everyday life? Will this material help my students to communicate meaningful ideas, thoughts, feelings and opinions? Is there some sense in which this material will deepen my students' understanding of cultures? And when we sat down and started thinking about what we wanted to do with outcomes, these three ideas were very much at the forefront of our mind. So you start by thinking about, well, what does it mean, the business of everyday life? And again, the Common European Framework has some ideas on this. It lays out these very clear can-do statements or sort of statements of competence at different levels. And it includes things like being able to explain why you're late, giving recommendations to foreign visitors, dealing with doctors, explaining menus, hiring cars, dealing with banks, making inquiries and chasing things up. Now, obviously, some of those may be more spoken kind of outcomes or spoken kind of genres. Some of them, things like making inquiries, chasing things up, may also involve a degree of writing. Okay, so these are just some examples at a kind of more micro level of desirable outcomes, or the kinds of conversations and written genres that you might want to encourage your students to be able to have. Okay, in terms of exchanging ideas and feelings, I think it means things like this. I think it means helping students to get to know people, helping them to talk about their weekend better, talk about their feelings, talk about their jobs, talk about things in the news. And, as they get better, talk about politics, the economy, society, talk about historical events, that kind of thing. And in terms of broadening knowledge of other cultures, I think it means using classroom material as a way of kind of bringing the world into the classroom through English, or using the material as a way of providing a window onto different aspects of culture around the world, and using these windows, these views, as both vehicles for language, which might be useful for the students, and as points of comparison and points of departure, ways for students to think about how their own experience of life, how their own countries, their own cultures are similar and different to those from other places. And we're very much interested in both. We're very much interested in the similarities as well as the differences. So, across different levels of outcomes, for example, we have reading texts about schooling in Korea. We have a listening about kids who went to school in both the UK and in Spain. And the students read these things, compare and contrast what's similar, what's different, what's better, why. They read about housing issues around the world, and they think about how similar or different their own contexts might be. They read about going out in Krakow and going out in other cities around the world. And again, they think about, what sounds similar, what differences there might be, where would they recommend people to go out in their own town or city. So there's a kind of degree to which the input of cross-cultural information helps the students to kind of word their own realities or word their own worlds as well. They read about the Dragon's Den, this kind of TV show, like a show where wannabe business people or budding entrepreneurs pitch ideas to successful business people to see if they can get investment. And there's a text about the Dragon's Den in Afghanistan and reality TV in Afghanistan. There's a reading about a Chinese folktale connected to money, and they explore some Chinese sayings about money. And again, they discuss the degree to which they represent or differ from their own personal beliefs and feelings about these things. There's a text about being a refugee and moving to a foreign country as a refugee. And there's a sort of reconsideration of what it might mean to be a refugee, the benefits that refugees might bring to countries. There's a text on famous Belgians, and again it leads to a point of cross-cultural comparison. It leads to a kind of project in which students think about who they would like to represent their own countries, famous people from their own countries or their own areas. So obviously, one of the ways in which we start to plan a course book is to think about these different kinds of areas and think about how they might play out across the course book. You also try to create some balance so that sometimes we're looking more at social areas of language use, sometimes we're looking more at academic areas of language use, and sometimes we're looking more at professional areas of language use, and thinking about what might be needed for students at different levels again. Okay? So, how does all this work in terms of what you see on the page? This is just one example I've picked from the intermediate level of outcomes. But, in a sense, this is a kind of principle which operates across the whole series. Each of the units, the first real double page that you see, leads students towards being able to have a particular kind of conversation. Okay? Sorry, I don't know if you can hear the pouring rain outside. London's summer weather, as we're sitting here in the middle of May. And in a way, what we've tried to do is to start these double page lessons by thinking about where we want the students to get to. It's this idea called backwards planning that's very popular in American high school syllabus planning and lesson planning. So if you look at, for example, the competencies and can-do statements that the CEFR requires at B2 level, which is where students are working towards if they're intermediate levels. B2 students apparently can talk about their feelings according to the Common European Framework. Okay? And that's all well and good. You might think, yes, of course, that's what they need to be able to do. But when you start thinking about what does that actually mean, what is a conversation in which they might talk about their feelings? And obviously that then involves more than just saying, you know, how are you? I'm happy. How are you? I'm sad. You need to start thinking about, well, when might you talk about your feelings? What might the context be? What might the conversation be? What vocabulary might be useful? What grammar might be useful? And you also might want to think about how might that be practiced in class. So the way that we've gone for practicing it here is, at the end of this double-page lesson, the students have a conversation. They think of a piece of good or bad news. They, in pairs, write little conversations like the one they've heard. They try to remember the conversations. They act it out. Okay? So all the time we're writing, and hopefully all the time teachers are teaching this material, it's guiding students towards being able to have conversations about good or bad news. Okay? So everything else that happens scaffolds their learning towards that kind of direction. Okay? So let's look at how this might work. At the top of each unit, you can see that what really drives the writing isn't the grammar. What drives the writing is what it is students will learn how to do. And for me, this is a kind of fundamental question that any teacher needs to be able to answer, really. When you're sitting down and planning, or when you're thinking about going into your class, I think you need to be able to answer what it is that you think students will be able to do better at the end of the hour or 45 minutes or whatever that they've got with you. And also, in a sense, why you think that's a desirable goal, why you think being able to do that particular thing is a worthwhile target. So we start each unit by making it very clear what the outcomes will be. So, you know, in this unit, you learn how to talk about how you feel and why. You learn how to give responses to news. Excuse me, quick thunder break there. So the students can see quite clearly, okay, this is what I'm going to learn to do here. Here's the grammar that's going to help me do this. Here's the vocab that's going to help me do this. But what's primary is the outcome, the conversational goal that the material is leading them towards. We begin this with some vocabulary. Initially, it looks like it's just single words, and you know it kind of is, obviously. You need to learn some single words to talk about your feelings. There's visual support here. How are the people feeling? Why? As soon as you get into the why, though, of course, you're asking the students to extend beyond the single words, and you're asking them to kind of grammar their output in a sense. So I don't know, you know, the parents look really stressed because the kid's been crying for hours. The kids won't stop crying. The old lady nearby, she looks quite concerned. She looks quite worried. Probably because she feels sorry for the kids. She feels sorry for the parents. She's been through it all herself. The couple next to them look furious. They look like they're in a really bad mood because the kids screaming is driving them mad a little bit, etc. So they use some of these words. Obviously, as they're doing this task, the teacher will find out which vocab they're having problems with, might explain it to the group, to the whole class, might get extra examples up on the board. When the teacher's running through the answers, the teacher might paraphrase, might give extra examples of things. It may be that the students say things like, you know, in picture 2, the man on the right is in a good mood. He retire. Yeah, right. So the man on the left there, he looks like he's in a very good mood. He looks really happy. Probably because he's retiring or because he has just retired. Okay, so the teacher can kind of rephrase and re-grammar some of the student output. There's a little kind of meaning check, just in case the teacher hasn't gone through these things. You group the words to show which ones mean you're tired. You know, exhausted? Which ones mean you're ill? Okay, you know, for example, stressed maybe, a bit down maybe. Yeah, which ones mean you're sad, happy, unsure, angry, etc. Then there's a personalisation. Have you had any of these feelings recently? Why? And again, as soon as you get into the personalisation and as soon as you get into the why, you start to go beyond the single word level and you start to push the students to use this language in some kind of personalised discourse. And this is again where the teacher can help out, paraphrase, reformulate student output, get whole sentences up on the board, help them grammar things. To consolidate all of this vocab work, because obviously, you know, not all of this will go into all students at the same time. At the back of the book, and now online actually, there's a vocabulary builder which gives extra definitions. You know, if you're exhausted, you're really tired. And it kind of builds up what students can do with that. So it shows them extra collocations, extra examples. Sit down, you must be exhausted, I'm absolutely exhausted, etc. It also gives little notes, little explanations, kind of how vocabulary works. So there's a thing about most ED adjectives come from verbs that are commonly used. So, you know, I'm bored. Bore, football bores me, I'm sorry to bore you with my problems. You know, I'm really confused. I don't want to confuse you by giving you too much information. And there's also extra exercises. So in the workbook that accompanies the series, they get whole sentences, grammaticalized sentences with some of the adjectives and phrases from the vocab section. Here they look at prepositions that often go with them. Next, we move on to the grammar. Okay, so, you know, we're still looking at grammar, we're still teaching grammar. We know that teachers expect to see grammar. But for us, the main thing is the grammar is secondary to the communicative goal. The grammar isn't looked at in isolation. The grammar is looked at in conjunction with other structures, with vocabulary, and within a context in which we want students to be able to use it. Here we're looking at these copular verbs, linking verbs, be, feel, look, seem, sound. Okay, they can all be followed by adjectives. In essence, the actual example at the front of the book, it's kind of lexical grammar. It's looking at 8 questions, 8 comments, and 8 responses. So it's things like, are you okay? You look a bit stressed. I am, I'm really behind with work. I've got exams next week. Are you all right? You look exhausted. I can't remember what the answer is. Are you all right? You look exhausted. Always check your answers before you decide to do a presentation. I can't remember what the answer is to that one. So, you know, it's things like, is Julie okay? She sounded a bit disappointed. Yeah, I think she expected to get a better mark as she had studied so much. So as you can see here, there's an interaction of all kinds of grammar. You've got the past perfect there. You've got things like, bye! I've got exams next week. Again, the teacher can expand upon this. You know, I've got an interview next week. I've got a date next week. I've just found out I've got a new job. It's the present perfect. Why? From the past to now. So whether or not the teacher focuses on these things, excuse me, whether or not the teacher focuses on these things, there's extra grammar there. The students are being exposed to grammar in a way that they're not when they just get these PPP lessons which only look at one structure. The students have to write their own responses, so there's a chance for them to kind of mess around with what's possible here. There's a chance for them to try out different sorts of grammar here. And at the back of the book, there's a grammar reference section, yeah? So, you know, they get extra examples, they get extra explanations, they get extra exercises to practice this kind of thing, possibly looking at it in slightly different kinds of contexts. We also have a section called Language Patterns, which looks at this kind of grey area that's sort of halfway between lexis and grammar, the kind of thing that often students have real problems with because it's just not made obvious to them, or they don't get exposed to this kind of thing. So one of the things we noticed was when you're talking about your feelings, you often use expect, and expect has its own particular kind of grammar connected to it. So, is she okay? She sounded a bit down. Yeah, she expected to get a better mark. I was really surprised. I was shocked. I expected London to be more modern. I'm so stressed. I didn't expect to have so much homework. I was really furious. I was annoyed. We didn't expect it to take so long. Oh, I was a bit taken aback. I was a bit surprised. I didn't expect you to be so early. We recommend doing two-way translation into your own language and then at a later date back into English to encourage you to notice the gaps here. Obviously, with this grammar, we're not expecting all students will learn and perfectly use all of this grammar immediately. We're not expecting they'll never make mistakes with it again. I guess what we are expecting is that at least they'll have some clearer idea of how they might use it in a limited kind of context to achieve the communicative goals here. And hopefully through the back of the book they might also just get some extra ideas about how it can be used in alternative kinds of contexts. What they then get in these double pages near the front is a kind of model conversations. These are conversations similar to the conversations that the students hear later, that the students try to have later. And I came to a realisation in my own teaching that one of the reasons I was getting better in my own main foreign language, which was Indonesian at the time, was that I was hearing lots of normal spoken Indonesian and just kind of having the opportunity to copy it. And I felt that my students weren't getting enough exposure to the kinds of conversations that they might want to be able to have themselves. So here, it's basically saying to the students, okay, you've looked at some vocabulary, we've seen how to use it a little bit, you've looked at some grammar, which incidentally recycles some of the vocabulary. So I don't know if you noticed here, it's things like stressed, exhausted, a bit down, confused, relaxed. So there's a kind of covert recycling of the grammar, of the vocabulary within the grammar. Here, they hear these conversations. They're kind of models of the conversations students will go on and have themselves later. They find out how the people feel and why. Okay, so they explore that. They do a little bit of speaking. So we encourage kind of human responses to the texts that they've processed. The texts aren't just there to be comprehended and to be checked. They're there to be responded to discuss, to critique, to think about and to relate to. We then look at this other kind of feature that we've developed, which again is a way of bringing together grammar and vocabulary and trying to explore the kinds of things that fluent speakers do in everyday conversations. So one of the things we were thinking was when you're talking about your feelings, you often commiserate or congratulate. So it's things like, I can't drink at the moment, I'm pregnant. Really? Congratulations. I'm so excited, I'm going to Canada to study English. Wow, that's great. Oh, I'm so disappointed, I'm afraid I won't be able to meet you tonight. Oh, what a shame. Are you sure? Bit worried actually, because my brother's not very well. Oh no, I'm really sorry, I hope it's not too serious. And we integrate pronunciation into this. So we look at how with positive responses our voice goes higher. Wow, that's great. With negative responses it goes lower. Oh, what a shame. Students listen, they practice, and again, obviously they won't all do that fluently henceforth. Some of them will adapt to that better than others. Some of them may decide they don't like the way that people say these things in English and may stick with their own, flatter ways of saying things. It's their choice. You can't force the horse to drink, but you can take it to water. And then finally, there's your conversation practice. So it's almost like saying, okay, so we've looked at the vocab, we've looked at the grammar and how the grammar interacts with the vocab. You've heard conversations in which all of this is used. You've looked at some response expressions. We've broken it all down for you. Now you try and put it all back together. And I think the great thing about teaching like this is kind of two or three things actually. One is it's very easy to extend. You can get the students to record this, you can get the students to write or to video their own conversations, you can correct their output in the context of these particular kinds of conversations. If you've got a class blog or anything like that, they can video themselves, they can record themselves, the conversations can go up there. You can encourage them to try to use as much of the input that they've looked at as they can, to show off how well they've done, how much they're using. It may be also that they want to use other kinds of language, and this gives you the space to offer that language to them. It also means that it's easier to sell the vocab and the grammar and the listening to the students, because if there's any kind of disgruntled, well, why are we learning this? The answer is because it's going to help you have a particular kind of conversation which is useful and which is similar to the kinds of conversations that you have in your own first language, and which is part of how, according to the Common European Framework, you get to the next level. It's also easy to revise and recycle, because you can look at gapped conversations the next lesson. You can look at the conversations from the listening. You can look at the audio script. You can gap bits out. You can see how much they can remember. You can just get them to repeat the task with a different student. It's much easier to recycle, in a sense, than, you know, the present perfect simple. If you've done the present perfect simple, what exactly is it you're expecting them to remember about it? What aspects of it? What lexicalizations of it? In what kind of contexts? Here, the context is narrow enough to be relatively clearly defined and relatively clearly testable. One final thing to say is we've tried as far as possible with the series to keep the language both natural but also international. And this means looking as much as possible at the most frequent 3,000 words. And often the most frequent 3,000 words are not words that crop up in conversation very often. Here's just some examples: acknowledge, adequate, allegation, alliance, arise, breath, burden, carbon, clash, coal. And in order to kind of cover this language, sometimes you might be able to bring some of this language out in normal conversation. Other times you may need to introduce it explicitly in reading spreads or in listening spreads that aren't geared particularly towards one kind of conversation, as that opening spread was. You also try to ensure that they're consolidated, revised, recycled through the vocabulary builder, through other aspects of the course, such as the grammar reference. So as writers, we're very conscious of weaving this language in and then revisiting it, making it available to teachers and to students on a kind of covert level. Okay, there you go. Thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to see if I can stop the video now.